Gibson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. There was a time not so long ago when governments took responsibility, but listening to the Minister, it seems that that time has passed. No contrition, no humility for its calamitous government decisions. The events of the last few months, in particular, have been, even by the standards of the Tory Government, unbelievable. It's all the fault of Putin, it's all the fault of COVID. A big boy did it and ran away. We now have a situation where people across the UK, people in my constituency in North Ayrshire and Arran, are suffering real financial harm and real financial hardship as a result of the incompetence of this government. The Minister has said that there are tough roads ahead. There are indeed tough roads ahead, but those roads will not be travelled by all equally. And if the gentleman wants...
I'm hugely pleased the Honourable Lady's given way, and more of a courtesy than the Minister gave. Does she believe that the Minister would have us believe that their budget was nothing to do with the mortgage payers, 8,000 people paying a higher mortgage in Southwark, for example, and would like to blame Russia? Does she believe that the government should be taking measures to punish those who've profited in Moscow and in Russia since the war broke out, like the Prime Minister's own family to the tune of £7 million, for example?
I think the public are becoming increasingly wise to the snake oil salesman approach, where one thing is said and hand-wringing and head-shaking is used, but no real action to tackle, as the Honourable Gentleman said, those who profit, and profit in a way that most people would find obscene, is simply not tackled. The so-called mini-budget, which, if you listen to the Minister, you would think it hadn't happened at all, but the so-called mini-budget, which is an ironic thing to call it, because it's referred to as something small, but the damage it has caused is so very considerable. This budget revealed, for those who still may have harboured any vestiges of doubt, whose side the Tories are really on. The so-called mini-budget set to scrap the bankers' bonus cap, reduce taxes for the most well-off, cancel the planned increase in corporation tax, refuse to bring forward an extended windfall tax and weaken the rights of trade union members. And I have to say at this stage that Labour's opposition to the mini-budget amounted to £24 billion out of £43 billion of tax cuts, and it was left to the Honourable Member for Hayes and Harpington, as it so often is, to call this mini-budget what it actually was, the most socially divisive budget in a generation. And of course, I understand that Labour are a bit worried about upsetting hardcore Tory voters in England, but sometimes the harsh language has to be used. When the extent of just how fiscally irresponsible this entire budget was, then we see Labour demanding that the entire mini-budget should be reversed, which was not the original position once the markets took fright. Yet the Resolution Foundation noted that almost half of the gains from the proposed tax cuts would have gone to the richest 5%, who would gain an average of £8,650, while the poorest half of households would have gained an average of £230. Almost two-thirds, 65% of the gains from personal tax cuts announced would have gone to the richest fifth of households. And Torsten Bell from the Resolution Foundation described the measures as a simply staggering tax cut for richer households, and Save the Children described the tax cuts as a hammer blow to low-income families. £45 billion of unfunded tax cuts, almost exclusively to the benefit of the rich. And whilst all this was going on, the SNP were being urged in Scotland to follow the Tories in Westminster into the bowels of tax-cutting hell, where the most well-off would enjoy the windfall of a tax-cutting bonanza, and not least by the hapless member for Murray, amongst others. But of course, he U-turned on this, as he so often does with so much else. It's often hard to tell if he's going somewhere or coming back from where he has just been. It was, quite frankly, immoral for such a budget to be delivered when so many are struggling to pay their bills at the moment. But the consequences of announcing these measures, and again it's difficult to call it a mini-budget given its consequences, the consequences were catastrophic. The pound dropped by nearly 2% against the dollar, the lowest since 1985. The IMF rebuked the government for causing such damage to the economy, and international investors declared that the UK's greater economic suffering, more so than other similar countries, was a consequence of the, and I quote, moron premium it pays due to its terrible leadership under the Tories. The cost of this so-called moron premium stands at £30 billion. But for households across the UK, the cost of this staggering incompetence is still being counted. 41% of mortgage deals were pulled by banks, no longer able to offer these deals that had previously been available. This meant that over 1,700 mortgage products were reintroduced at rates 2% higher, leaving hundreds of thousands of families across the UK paying far more for their mortgages. Pensions almost collapsed, and the instability within the UK was the talk of the international steamy. And the Minister talked about restoring financial stability. But perhaps, had he not caused this instability, such urgent measures would not be needed. I will indeed.
It is true to say that mortgages are at their highest rate for 10 years in Germany. Does she blame the mini-budget for that? And if not, what does she think might be going on?
The honourable gentleman cannot escape the fact that the markets went into meltdown after the mini-budget. Now, I know that this government wants to pretend that the mini-budget didn't happen and the consequent run on the pound and the near collapse of the pensions system. I know that they would like to pretend this didn't happen. But government is about taking responsibility and even saying sorry when mistakes are made. I will indeed.
Well, my friend also point out to the honourable gentleman, the member for Devizes, that the government cannot have its cake and eat it. Sometimes in this chamber they talk about how Germany has an over-reliance on Russian gas, and then to simply try and use Germany as a comparator in the case of this argument is rather like comparing apples and avocados, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I'm sure that the honourable gentleman across the benches will be taking note of that, writing it down and learning the lessons that he needs to learn from that insight. But we now have a situation where there is not expected to be a reduction in mortgage rates anytime soon. Some estimates put additional mortgage costs at £500 per year, or a rise on average of £5,100 per by the end of 2024. 73, and I hear the chuntering from the benches opposite, talking about mortgage rates going down. Well, perhaps he would do well to reflect on the fact that 73% of mortgage holders are worried about rate rises. And alongside this, the UK government is set to raise taxes. It will balance the cost of its own incompetence on the backs of those who are already struggling. Those whose struggles have been made so much worse by a government which could not find its own backside with both hands. The number of Scots seeking mortgage help has nearly quadrupled. This is a result, again, of the staggering incompetence by this government, particularly galling for people in Scotland, the majority of whom roundly rejected this government. As if all this were not enough, we have soaring inflation, rising to over 10% in September, rates not seen since the early 1980s, outpacing normal earnings growth and expected to peak at 11%. Inflation is partly driven by sky-high energy costs. The one thing done to bring down energy costs is already being backtracked by this government, with expected rises to bills early next year, hammering households all over again, and could see bills of over £4,000 this coming April. The shadow of recession is looming over the UK, threatening Scotland's recovery from the pandemic, with the Scottish Government's budget £1.7 billion lower due to the impact of inflation and the need to help households on which the UK Government has turned its back. This means that in Scotland, budgets have had to be reprioritised across a range of areas to provide much-needed support. But sadly for the Labour Party, when Wales' budget is under pressure, it's the fault of the UK government because of how devolution works. But in Scotland, when the Scottish Government's budget is under pressure, it joins again with the Tories to condemn the SNP. And that is why, in Scotland, Labour is thrashing around in its death throes, because standing shoulder to shoulder with the Tories isn't working for them, and the people in Scotland are not fooled. It's bad enough that households across the UK are struggling to balance budgets in the face of soaring inflation, rocketing energy bills and huge increase in mortgage costs. It's bad enough that my constituents in North Ayrshire and Arran are facing unprecedented financial pressures, but whilst they do, they are watching the revolving door of government jobs which have been changing with breathtaking speed. The loss of a cabinet post is compensated for with 3 months' salary, and this applies even to those who were in post only for a few weeks. Sky News has reported that this ministerial churn has amounted to £709,000 in severance payments for former ministers and whips. A total of 71 ministers are eligible for this pay as a result of the instability of this government. In view of the financial distress our constituents are facing because of decisions made by this government, they have a right to know, our constituents have a right to know, who has taken these payments, which are due entirely as a result of the instability and incompetence of this government. Perhaps the Minister will be able to tell us today, but I certainly won't hold my breath. The honourable gentleman would like to...
I thank the honourable member for North Ayrshire and Arran for giving way. I was just wondering if she could remind me or refresh my memory that she's been talking about the severance pay the UK government pays to former ministers. What does the Scottish government do? Because it's my understanding that in Scotland, ministers who leave are also entitled to 3 months' pay, the same as for the UK government, and indeed do often take it up. Do you correct me if I'm wrong, right? I understand it's the same.
Gentleman, maybe he's listening to his some podcast or something, and he's not listening to half of this debate. The point of today's debate is the fact that the instability created by this government means that ministers who've been in post for a matter of weeks are hoovering up huge payoffs. Now, if the honourable gentleman can tell me if there's a precedent for this level of instability, I'm happy to sit down and let him explain it to me. I see that he's not attempting to do so, so maybe I should sit there and reflect on the fact that what he is attempting to defend is tens of thousands of pounds being paid to ministers in post for a matter of weeks. If he is happy to defend that, then he certainly won't have the confidence of my constituents. I will indeed.
I'm very grateful to Honourable Friend for giving way, and just to reassure her, I can confirm as a keen and close watcher of Scottish politics that in the Scottish Parliament, ministers don't resign on average every 4 days as they appear to do in Westminster.
I thank the honourable gentleman for that, and of course the honourable gentleman opposite seems to think that's okay and perfectly in order. Goodness knows what his constituents will make of it, but that's a matter for him. If Labour are concerned about these obscene ministerial payoffs, then they really must support the amendment from the honourable member for Glasgow East, which would prevent this situation. And that's really, really important, because we cannot allow this situation continue. All of this adds up to an incompetent government which has no direction and it has no judgment. It's brought us into this mess.
Form the House, the amendment wasn't selected. Yes, indeed. So there is no amendment, it's a straight vote.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Well, on that very point, I will say that I regret that this amendment has not been selected. The government has brought us into this mess, inflicted financial harm, and is thrashing around trying to fix it. And it really is a failure of the Labour Party to not be able to take on, in England, these arguments, because the Labour Party are now preparing for government. But it's actually been caught out, because its interim leader, who was intended to steady the ship, will now by himself, by default, lead them into the next election. A London-centric ostrich in common with the Tories who think he can dictate in a deluded fashion to Scotland just how much democracy it can have. I think you'll find when the votes are counted in Scotland that won't have worked very well for him. But the reality is that when Labour and the Tories dictate to Scotland at election time, they are in effect two baldy men fighting over a comb. The voters are sick to death in Scotland of being patronised, talked down to, and their right to choose their own path dismissed and ignored by those who set themselves above them as their betters. The UK is in a mess. It is broken. Scotland did not vote for this, and the incompetence of this government is impacting on Scotland in a way that is undemocratic, because we didn't vote for this. And it will never vote for a Labour Party that is trying to out-Tory the Tories to win Tory seats in England with a pretence that Brexit can be good for the UK and impose it on Scotland despite the damage it is causing. Shame on you, a plague on both your houses. Scotland will choose her own path and extract ourselves out of this sorry mess of Westminster. Scotland will choose her own path in spite of and because of this shower in Westminster.